Добрый день, уважаемые
участники, слушатели, гости EU-Russia Student Conference. Сегодня мы выходим в прямой эфир на 2 языках с уважаемыми экспертами и студентами по обе стороны с одной целью, выраженной в мотиве нашей конференции «To break down barriers».
Михаил, переключите, пожалуйста, на русский язык. Вы в оба канала говорите. И Вероника тоже переключитесь на русский язык.
Спасибо большое.
Всем добрый день.
Всем добрый день. Меня зовут Вероника Яковлева, и вместе с моим коллегой и соорганизатором конференции Михаилом Тягусовым сегодня мы проведем для вас эту панельную дискуссию. Мы с Михаилом принимали участие и в конференции прошлого года, которая на тот момент была организована нашими близкими друзьями из Австрии, Домиником Уроком и Игорем Мичкой, которые учились в Москве и решили, что между российской и европейской молодежью нужно действительно рушить существующие барьеры. В 2019 году в нашем мероприятии приняли участие 80 студентов из разных стран, из России и стран Европейского Союза, которые решали кейсы наших партнеров, ведущих компаний России и Австрии. В этом году мы хотим продолжить эту традицию, но в связи с карантином нам пришлось поменять формат и перенести мероприятие из офлайна в онлайн. Надеемся, что в следующем году нам удастся вернуться в офлайн формат, а сегодня мы проведем для вас мероприятие в данном формате с трансляцией на YouTube.
В этом году большая часть команды
организует сегодняшнее событие с студентами и выпускниками Высшей школы экономики. Мы очень рады, что мы можем продолжить традицию именно в ней, в университете с особой атмосферой истории, без информационной помощи которого сегодняшнее событие было бы невозможно. Поэтому мы бы хотели передать приветственное слово Ивану Андреевичу Груздеву, члену ученого совета Высшей школы экономики, директору по внутренним исследованиям и академическому развитию студентов Высшей школы экономики.
Коллеги, Иван Андреевич мне делегировал это право, эту честь. Меня слышно? Нормальный звук идет, да?
Да.
Меня зовут Кажанов Андрей Александрович, я директор Центра академического развития студентов. Мы рады поддерживать эту конференцию, рады оказывать ей финансовую и организационную помощь. Я хотел приветствовать всех участников. Наш центр занимается поддержкой студенческих научных инициатив в университете, в том числе организацией научных конференций. И мы рады поддержать такое интересное, актуальное и весьма представительное мероприятие. Очень приятно, что инициатива проведения конференции не пострадала из известных ограничений академической мобильности. Желаю всем участникам продуктивной работы с точки зрения научной коммуникации, научной коллаборации и нетворкинга в онлайн-среде, где, кажется, единственное, где можно делать науку без социальной дистанции. Спасибо.
Спасибо большое. В таком случае мы переходим к нашей панельной дискуссии. И всем слушателям я напомню, что после панельной дискуссии нас еще ждут круглые столы по 4 темам и презентации решений 2 кейсов от партнеров нашего мероприятия. Все ссылки высылались вам по почте, в случае, если вы регистрировались как слушатели. Также они есть в наших социальных сетях. А данная панельная сессия транслируется на 2 языках, на русском и английском с синхронным переводом. Для этого также подготовлены 2 отдельные ссылки.
К сожалению, обстоятельства сложились
так, что один из спикеров, Александр Рар, научный директор Германо-Российского форума и старший советник президента Германо-Российской внешнеторговой палаты, вынужден сегодня находиться в самолете по пути в Россию для участия в Алдайском клубе и не сможет принять участие в сегодняшней панельной дискуссии. Однако мы заранее записали интервью с Александром Глебовичем, разместили его на нашем YouTube-канале и также будем ссылаться в наших вопросах уважаемым экспертам.
Comments online, so there'll still be a form of participation. So the esteemed speakers will be Mr. Sim Karen, former Chancellor of Austria, Alexander Varvarin, Vice President on Corporate Matters and Legal Matters of the Russian Union of Industrial Entrepreneurs, and Sergei Shvetsov, first Deputy Chairman of the Bank Russia and member of the board of the Bank Russia. Welcome to For us, it's a great honor to host and welcome such very important speakers who found time. We, as moderators, suggest that we conduct our panel discussion in the following manner. First, we'll have speech by Mr. Christian Kern as representing the European side, and then we'll have more detailed discussion of such as digitalization in the context of the European Green Deal. Also, we'll be happy to receive questions from our viewers and listeners, so feel free to put those questions on YouTube. And also we'll encourage lively discussions between the speakers too. So, Veronica, you'll have the right to put the first question. We'll start with the question to Mr. Christian Kern. We would like to hear from him a brief review of the Russian-European relations. How do you actually evaluate this current state of these relations, particularly not so much the political aspect, but more economic aspect, which often doesn't get as much coverage in the media versus political aspects? Would you indicate some particular areas of cooperation between Russia and European Union, which in your opinion would serve as the basis for the further building of bridges between our countries, maybe which one should pay more attention to in order to reinforce them, especially as we might touch also on the matters of digitalization and cooperation in the framework of European Green Deal. As far as Green Deal, maybe we could talk about the possibilities of production of hydrogen as part of this Green Deal initiative. So over to you. The floor is yours.
Yeah, so thank you very much for the invitation, which I really appreciate. It's kind of a privilege to participate in such an sophisticated and distinguished exchange. And I just would like to start, before I answer your question, to give you a few remarks and a brief overview about my specific background and my personal career, because it helps perhaps a little bit to understand what I have done in the past and how I see the future and how we should tackle the issues we have on the table. And right now, all of our lives is massively affected by COVID. It's not only a matter of society exchange, it's extremely influential on the economy. And I think it's really important to understand what is coming next and how will COVID affect the cooperation between countries, the cooperation between people, and also between corporates. And so what I can tell you briefly is, if you look at my personal background, I have been starting in the energy industry. As a young man, I was building hydropower plants and operating it, and then later on switching to trading of energy. And I had the privilege in this time to check if we are going to acquire a Russian company. There was a privatization wave, which was at the end of the 1990s, early 2000s starting. Later on, we had a project with Hydro about the construction of a huge, massive hydropower plant in Siberia at the lower Angara River. We backed down because it was a massive challenge we couldn't tackle. I think our friends from Russia Hydro have, in the meantime, accomplished the project. It's definitely one of the most impressive infrastructure projects in Europe. Then I moved to the Austrian Railways, and there I have become the CEO there, which is one of the larger companies in our country, 45,000 employees, and doing business in 21 countries. And there have been close links to our Russian friends, because we understand that logistics is nothing which could work out in just one single country. You need to connect, you need to build bridges to improve your results and to enhance your business models. And this is something which I have still on my agenda, because today I'm acting also as a member of the board of directors of Russian Railways. To tell you the truth, I'm extremely honored about that, because the company is so professional, has a great management team. They're doing a lot of interesting stuff, and is definitely one of the most influential companies in Russia, running a very important future agenda. But there was one specific aspect which I have done as a CEO of ÖBB with my colleague, the CEO of Russian Railways. I have set up an exchange program for apprentices and young leaders in ÖBB and RGD, which was really important for us and our corporate culture, because I have seen it always as extremely important to understand how our partners are ticking, how their mentality is, and to look for ways how we can cooperate and improve our cooperation even further. My impression was always that I was really impressed how educated the young Russians have been who were coming to Austria, how polite they have been, how professional, and how ambitious they have been looking at the future. And this is something which makes me really self-confident and happy about what's coming next. But let me come back to your initial question. And what I believe basically is that after COVID, we will perhaps differentiate in the world before and the world after COVID. And what we are facing right now is that there are some important drivers and trends which have been in place for a while, which are now significantly accelerating and shaping our future. And what I also believe is that we shouldn't underestimate the reach and of these consequences, because if you look back to the financial crisis of 2008, it is true that we still are fighting the consequences of that. In 2008, a lot of people got the feeling that capitalism is rigging them and they don't get a fair chance and a fair share of the wealth they are producing. One of the consequences was that we have seen an enormous shift to right-wing populism in political systems, which has definitely detrimental consequences for international cooperation. To give an example, almost 10 years after Lehman collapsed, we have seen Brexit. Mr. Trump is still a phenomenon and still in charge. My personal opinion is hopefully not after November this year. But these are trends which you shouldn't underestimate. And then even more, the COVID crisis goes even deeper than the Lehman collapse and the subprime crisis. And so therefore, I expect that what's coming up right now is something which is needed to be engaged over a longer period to prevent and tackle and mitigate the consequences of that. And if you look at the 3 or 4 main building blocks of such a future economy and world, I think I've been talking about the acceleration of trends. And one which is really perhaps the most worrying one is definitely that we see a trend which I would call anti-globalization. A trend where countries believe they could be self-sufficient on their own. They don't need to reach out to partners. They are shutting down their borders. They are shutting down the international cooperation, trade volumes, and so on. And one of the symbolic expressions of this is definitely the battle around Huawei and the relation between the United States and China. And not so much inclined to talk about Huawei, but one of the consequences is that what we are facing is a separation of the tech systems of China and perhaps the Western world. And we all know if you look at the world and try to solve issues with such a very nationalistic approach, you might fail. And in the end, it's definitely to the detriment of all people involved. So what we really need is a way how we can find a fair cooperation on the economic side. And I think the trade agreements between various countries, various blocs are constitutional for that. And we need to watch what's coming up next, specifically with the relations to China. But up to now, we don't have too much reason to be optimistic, because we're entering a phase where everybody tries to get along on its own, which is definitely not a good development. Because if you look at the pure figures, in the last 5 years, at least 1/3 of the economic growth have been coming from the consumption and from the Chinese market. So one of the consequences is that we are not only seeing that this is deteriorating, this anti-globalization trend, anti-cooperation trend is not only deteriorating the economic relations, but it's also causing international frictions. And to be honest, and I think I'm not telling you something surprising, we need to be concerned also about the Russian-EU relations. And just what happened recently shows a deep distrust and a lack of understanding of both sides. And this is definitely not to the favor of Russia, and this is definitely not to the favor of the European Union. And what I strongly believe is that we need to understand that this is not a system rivalry, as some people put it. It will not be possible that Europe imposes its political system on Russia, and in turn Russia imposes its political system on Europe. And even more, we need to find a way where we can stepwise create more trust, more trade, which is definitely a means for change and for an improved relation and perception of the both sides. I just want to give you another example. I believe that here politics is often in a very detrimental way interfering in economy. When I have been a prime minister in Austria, I have always tried to lobby or to explain why we need this Nord Stream gas pipeline project, because I hadn't seen this as a matter of international relations. For me, it was just a pure question: is it helpful for Russia? Is it helpful for Europe, or is it not? And if you look at the necessities in Europe, we definitely need a strong industry because it's creating jobs and is something which is really creating the backbone of our economies. And so therefore for us, it's a simple decision. If anybody would like to bring more gas to the European markets, which would lead to a mitigation of prices or perhaps even lower gas prices for the Austrian industry, I would say he is highly welcome. But looking at Nord Stream today, I think it's unfortunately not possible to discuss it in a cool and calm manner, to sort out economic interests and then to take a decision. And that's what I meant when I said we need to come back to a more understanding full cooperation between Russia and the European Union. And then there is a third part, which is also important to understand this anti-globalization stance and these international frictions, which is I mentioned it before, this move to populism in some political systems. And I think the inner character of populism is to split apart societies, to separate between winners and losers, to separate between us and the others. And this is something definitely which is not solving problems, but creating new problems. And I just would like to refer to the question of inequality in societies, because what, for example, Mr. Trump did, if you look at his healthcare politics, if you look at his tax politics, and I'm not referring to international issues, is definitely creating winners and losers in the United States of America. And the consequence is that if anybody believes that a society can in the long term be stable, where just 1% of the population owns almost 75% of the wealth, I think then it's completely a wrong assumption. This is in the long term not working out, is causing troubles, is motivating populism, and again, this separation of societies is something like trying to fight fire with adding kerosene. So we need to be aware, and so I think we have good reasons to stay awake in the night of the US elections, because this is definitely very important for the future relations, not only between Russia and Europe, but specifically also between the US, China, and some other blocs of the global world. I would like to accelerate my considerations, and so that we have time also for some questions. I've told you that COVID is accelerating trends which have been already in place. Digitalization is an important one. What we are doing right now, my company, which I'm running, has investments in 14 tech companies, is doing technology consulting. And what I see is that COVID is really kind of a catalyst to motivate, to bring on developments. And again, what you see on the retail side is that COVID is creating losers and winners also in the economy. If you look at the market cap and the value, for example, of companies like Microsoft, Netflix, Apple, Amazon, you name it, you have seen that this kind of business models who can deal with social distancing and remote business models are superior. And I think everybody who is working in retail needs to consider how we can digitize its business model. It's of utmost importance, but it's not only a matter of B2C business models, business to consumers, it's also a matter of B2B business models, business to business models, because what you see is that competition is getting fiercer and fiercer. So this will be the situation for the next at least 36 months. And so therefore, what we see is a lot of businesses, a lot of huge corporations who now really start to severely change their production, their value creation processes to a more digitized system. And I think it's a large untapped blue oceans for new companies, for great startups, for example, who are sometimes acting much more creative and faster than big companies. And this is creating a very interesting space for the future. Then there is a third point, and I'm just mentioning not because it's my third priority, because I think it's a consequence and it's affected by digitalization and this globalization issue, which is fighting climate change. And what you see right now is that a lot of political decision makers have understood that we need to adapt our politics. That's at least true for the European Union. But what you see here is that you have not such an easy playing field, because if you talk about subsidies for hydrogen, for batteries, for pharmaceutical products or so, or industries, then it's easy to come to a commitment because it's just only about money. But if you talk regulation, then it becomes much more trickier. And I think there is one elephant in the room, which is CO2 taxation, which is the best means to prevent environmental pollution. But how to execute it is still an open issue, because it would have massive consequences, not only for Europe and the European countries, but also for our trading partners. Because if there would be something like a significant CO2 tax, of course, Europe would need to impose it to its trading partners and then push new trading agreements, making sure that everybody who is trading with the European Union should participate in this kind of schemes. So climate change, for sure, is the top priority of our days. So we know that someday we will have a vaccine against COVID, but there is no vaccine which will help us to tackle and fight climate change. So this is something which is here to stay. And to some extent, it's not a bad message, not environmental-wise, but I believe this will create immense business opportunities. And I have been referring to our own technology company portfolios. We are only investing and building in companies who could contribute to tackling climate change, to make the world more sustainable. I can tell you it's a profitable business. And by the way, it's also great fun, which we really love to do, because it gives your work a certain purpose, which I really appreciate. So in a nutshell, that's what I see as the main challenges. I think it would be also interesting to elaborate a little bit more about the role of states, because the responsibility of states is growing. You know that public debt is increasing massively all over the place. We know that the national banks are creating a lot of fresh money to finance this public debt, and this has as a consequence that the state is no longer somebody who is checking the rules of the game, but is also participating directly in the game of economy. And so this needs to be handled cautiously. There are some good examples. I think what Russia is doing right now in the field of economic politics looks really interesting and promising. So you have to find a way how to steer and frame economy. In the more Western systems, it's not so common, and we need to look if we are not going to see a massive squandering of money, but to try to find a way how we can create impact. And there it comes to the character of politics today, because the political elites, specifically in many of the European EU countries, are really great if it comes to PR, are really great in addressing people. But COVID has demonstrated that there is a lack of competence if it comes to execution of programs. So my very last remark, so you have been asking me about the relations. I've seen Russia always as an integral part of Europe. Europe is not complete without Russia, and my personal deepest and sincerest wish would be that your generation will understand that and find a way to make it better than our predecessors and perhaps even my generation. Thank you very much for your attendance.
Спасибо вам большое за такой объемный и широкий.
Thank you very much for very comprehensive and broad-scale comments and a wide range of issues that you've covered. With your permission, by way of follow-up, as a follow-up question, perhaps, when you planned conducting this conference, which was back in the spring of this year, it seemed to be a dark age of economic relations between Russia and the European Union was behind at that time, it seemed, prior to this current crisis. But today, under conditions of today, the political factors that you also mentioned, but things are going down because the overall global trend of virus and pandemic, among others. So in terms of forecasts, one of the scholars recently was asked about the forecast on relations between Europe and Russia. He said that the model that existed between Russia and the European Union had been exhausted, had become outdated. So one needs to look for a new model of interaction. So in terms of a forecast, perhaps, would you say that the previous model of relations between Russia and Europe is still viable? If it's not viable anymore, what should be the touch points as far as political issues that where Russia and European Union need to cooperate to resolve?
Okay, so there is an interesting discussion about who is the biggest economic superpower in the world. And I can tell you, when I have been of your age in the 1980s, end of 1980s, there was a big debate about when Japan will surpass the United States as the most important economic power. There have been great books, great speeches, research, and so on. But we know that just a few years later, Japan ended up in dire straits and still has not fully recovered from the problems, structural problems they had. And finally, the United States, that was the wide perception, stayed as number one. Today, the main question is China challenging the US? And there are a lot of KPIs around which are showing that they are, others are showing that they don't. But what I tell you is, this is a completely absurd debate, and it's completely wrong, because economic-wise, the biggest power on the planet is definitely the European Union. So that was always my understanding as a European leader, that we could have much more confidence. And so therefore, Europe is attractive for Russia, and Russia is very attractive for Europe. And if you look at the wider landscape, you will see that one of the mega trends is the rise of China. The main question is, what how can we balance the economic relations to this big country. Another issue is the even more urgent matter of climate change. And if you look at the matter of equality, fairness in taxing big corporates, for example, fighting inequality, and so on and so forth, I don't know a single issue which could be solved single-sided. Europe is not going to fix it, Russia is not going to fix it, China is not going to fix it, and so on and so forth. And I think our great opportunity and great chance, and I really appreciated when Emmanuel Macron proposed that, is to build a stronger network and stronger relation and agenda between Russia and the EU, and define a clear agenda what we are going to do. And this must be related to climate change. This must be related to trade exchange. This must be related to the mutual economic development, because if Russia gets richer, Europe will export more goods. If Europe gets richer, Russia will have an interesting market and access to technologies. So I think it would really make sense to sit down, restructure the agenda, and find a way how we can really tackle the big issues of today. Unfortunately, this is a lot of hope right now. But time will go by, and hopefully, so these big issues we had on the table just recently will calm down and no longer be the decisive ones. So it makes sense, and I can tell you also, if I talk to colleagues in economy all over Europe, and specifically in Germany and Austria, in the business world, you don't need to explain the concept of a close cooperation between Europe and Russia, which makes me hoping, and I think the next generation which you represent is also a good reason for being hopeful.
Спасибо большое за ваше мнение.
Thank you very much for your opinion. We also believe that one needs to continue dialogue, and not only in economic terms, but also in the language of civic societies. So, in our modest opinion, one such form of interaction could be exchange of experience, and possibly transformation of such interaction as far as new energy ideas, the use of hydrogen. So we're happy to have you in this discussion. And I would like to move to the next speaker.
Thanks.
An expert on the European. Mr. Varvarin? Yes, hello.
Я хотел бы осветить позицию бизнеса, прежде всего российских компаний, относительно вопроса.
I would like to cover the position of Russian companies as far as the hydrogen. On the whole, in recent times,
И особое внимание сейчас сосредоточено на обсуждении в Евросоюзе введения трансграничного углеродного регулирования. Часто эта тема подается со знаком минус, но не совсем так все просто. На данный момент мы находимся на том этапе развития.
So currently we are at the development stage of developing climatic mechanism when it can create both significant risks and the factors that are slowing the economy. But on the other hand, it may open additional opportunities. Also, thanks to the efforts of companies and states, we can mitigate risks and maximize opportunities. So the opportunities are connected with the fact that Russia has climatic assets that can be used to protect its objective and fair economic interests, as well as other states that are actively using the climatic agenda to promote their economic interests. Climatic assets can be also used for the benefit of the Russian businesses. So I would like to name those climate assets. First of all, since 1990, Russia has reduced the greenhouse gases more than other countries. According to some calculations, this is about 48%. Even the most pessimistic scenarios, it's more than 20%. Russia also has 20% of the world forests that provide the absorption of greenhouse gases. Within the state measures, we've been implementing a lot of events promoting the reduction of greenhouse gases, which costs thousands of billions of dollars. And as a result of those events, by 2030, according to our estimates, Russia will be the absolute leader in the reduction of greenhouse gases. Russia also has the low carbon electro-energy industry than some other countries. Around 80% of energy production in Russia is being produced at low emission plants. And the majority of opportunities in Russia with the introduction of carbon border regulations is connected with the opportunity to promote low carbon products on the European market, which is being developed right now. As for the risks, first of all, they are connected with the possibility of using different fiscal forms, different restriction measures for state regulation that can result in different negative economic consequences. If we introduce the carbon border regulation, the financial losses of Russian exporters, according to different experts, may amount to about 2 to 4 billion euro per year if we apply this regulation to most energy-intensive industries. If we introduce this kind of regulations for certain sectors, which is most probable scenario right now, the economic load in Russia will be around 1 billion euro.
Конечно, являются существенными деньгами, но не критичными.
So this is not a critical amount. The main declared objective of this mechanism is to prevent the leakage of carbon industries, the transfer of them to countries with less severe regulations. But we need to understand that those measures are quite protectionist, and they are dictated by the economic interests of the EU countries. So most entrepreneurs in Russia proceed from this stance. First of all, European states seek to become to make the European producers more competitive and reduce the dependence on imports of energy. Quite recently, our representatives participated in a roundtable on carbon border regulations in terms of public consultations organized by our European colleagues. So the discussion was very revealing. The European companies, first of all, perceive it as a protectionist measure. And our European colleagues just told us straight away, on the one hand, they don't want to lose markets. And on the other hand, they don't want to lose the state support that they have right now. We speak about free carbon quotes for the European industries. Overall, there is a huge discussion on how the introduction of carbon regulation complies with the EU norms, specifically according to Article 3 of the Framework Convention on Climate Change. Those measures cannot be used to limit international trade. Similar measures can also contradict the WTO norms, and we may see a very serious legal discussion about this carbon regulation. So most questions we have now, what kind of form will we have, form of this regulation? If Russian business understands that this regulation is not fair, is not balanced, it's logical that we'll pose a question about introducing some response measures to such regulation. And it's not that those will be like mirror-like measures. They may be different in terms of product positions that are imported. It could be quite a painful situation for the economic turnover between Russia and the EU. And it's important to avoid such radical decisions, to sit down and negotiate, to work out a stance. If this kind of decision on the carbon regulation is implemented, we need to make sure that the ideas are launched, that they are clear not only for the European partners, but for the Russian businesses as well. Thank you very much for your opinion. I have a question.
Подскажите, пожалуйста, какие меры сейчас может предпринимать российский
What
бизнес?
kind of measures can Russian businesses implement right now? Probably you have the information about the measures that have already been implemented in companies concerning the high carbon products. I mean the metal industry, which is one of the main industries. And the second question, provided that we have this kind of border regulation, and we'll speak about the losses for the trade turnover, can these losses be compensated by, for example, further interaction in energy sphere within the big strategic plan for the reduction of carbon footprint, which we call the European Green Deal, and mass introduction of hydrogen as the main energy source? So maybe Russia can propose to Europe some kind of cooperation in the production and supply of clean hydrogen that we've been speaking a lot about. So first of all, what to do? There is two elements. Firstly, we need to continue the discussion with our European colleagues. We need to insist on fair and transparent introduction of transborder regulation. And we need to have dialogue on several issues. First of all, the release from the payment for the industries for which the EU gives free quotas. Otherwise, the system will be totally unfair. Then identify the fair amount of payment per unit of carbon products. We need to speak about the calculation of carbon intensity according to the methods approved by Russia and the EU. We need to speak about the possibility of reducing the assessment of carbon intensity thanks to the implementation of climate projects within the country, because maybe the company will not only reduce carbon footprint, but maybe it will create the mechanisms for absorption of those greenhouse gases. So we also need to consider those elements. But most importantly, in our own country, we need to work out a proper regulation for the greenhouse gases emissions. So we need to create a comprehensive system of emission accounting, including the reports of companies in terms of their existing emissions. We need to develop comprehensive norms and regulations and conditions for the implementation of climatic projects to reduce the emissions, to release the carbon units, to organize the market for those carbon units. We need to carry out comprehensive works to enhance the comprehensiveness of assessment. According to our estimates, the existing methodology significantly reduces the absorbing capabilities of Russian forests in comparison with other countries. our absorption capacity of forest is like 2 or 3 times lower than in other countries, and we ask why, and still there is no answer. It's not only about forests, it's also about other ecosystems that absorb carbon. So it's important to finalize the preparation of the draft law on the regulation of greenhouse gases emission. This draft law has been introduced to the government, but this process has been delayed now. But it's important to adopt this law, just to understand what kind of carbon policy our country will have. So it's true that the questions about hydrogen are quite relevant. A lot of companies today have started implementing policy on the reduction of emissions. A lot of big companies have developed within their green policy comprehensive measures on the reduction of carbon footprint. I know that metal industry has been working intensively on this problem. The Russian gas industry is also actively participating in the development of hydrogen energy. Around 76% of them use natural gas, and considering the potential of Russia in the extraction of natural gas, we see a huge potential for cooperation also with the EU. However, there is one detail. Some European partners say that the hydrogen that is taken from the natural gas or on atom plants, this is not the hydrogen we need. It's some kind of bad hydrogen, but we need the one that is extremely pure, based on renewable energy resources. So we know that the price of this hydrogen will be excessive, but we think that we don't need to distinguish between different kinds of hydrogen, like blue, yellow, white. We just need to discuss collaboration in this area because there's a huge potential. Russia has a huge potential on the supply of hydrogen to the EU. Thank you very much. As you are on the crossroads of those negotiations, including about the carbon regulation, we heard and you heard the position of the European colleagues, so you do have this information. What is your forecast? Within this collaboration, will we manage to negotiate with to strike a deal with our European colleagues so that it's not some unilateral measure as China did it when they introduced those carbon units? So if we introduce those carbon units in Russia like China did when China was preparing for this regulation. So is the forecast positive or negative? I think that the forecast is positive. And these trade institutes that are trading carbon units, we need to develop them within the Paris Agreement at the international scale and go away from the attempts to do it at the regional level, because this is not a correct approach. Since the mechanism of the Paris Agreement have not been developing dynamically enough, the EU decided to make a step forward and discuss the introduction of this regulation on their territory. Our European partners have been widely discussing this issue with all the interested parties and countries, including Russia, China, and other countries. So we've been an active participant of this discussion, and I think we'll strike a deal because we don't see the overall introduction of carbon tax everywhere. The partners are not interested in increasing the price of the important raw materials, including metal industry. So we will have to find some kind of agreement And I hope that if we do introduce this kind of regulation, it will be a gradual process with delays. And during those delays, Russia will be able to develop its own regulation system for the greenhouse gases emission and will create its own system of carbon unit trade that I hope will be connected with the European system. So we need to act together. For example, the reduction of emissions in Russia, which is verified in Russia, will be acknowledged by the EU. So we need to create some unified regulation system, preferably at the national and the international level, at the level of the Paris agreements. But if we do it together with the EU, we'll negotiate and we'll collaborate. Once we started speaking about green subjects, I would like to talk about the green financing, green investment. So here I pose a question to our speaker from the Bank of Russia, Sergei Shevtsov. Could you tell us what green financing is and why today we've been discussing those green finances a lot in the Bank of Russia and in Russia and abroad? Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank you for the invitation. It's a very interesting discussion, a very important one. The relations between Western Europe and Russia is very important for our economy and for the whole world. So thank you very much. As for green financing, this is not like a luxury, not something like fashionable. It's just a reaction to the overall trend to reach the sustainable objectives. So what is sustainable development? This means that we want to reach our today's objective, not compromising our future objectives. So we need to avoid developing economies so that tomorrow we have some disasters and our next generations face some difficulties in overcoming the negative effects that we generated today. So it means long-term planning for 20, 30 years, including the reduction of emissions. So all those issues generated the notion of green financing, which means the financing of activities that are aimed at sustainable development, not to the detriment of our future generations. If the UN and the governments of countries themselves of emerging economies, developed economies, if those countries understand these objectives, then for a business, it's kind of a pragmatic issue. If companies follow the principles of correct sustainable development, then these companies are managing risks better. And these companies are less risky, so you can lend money to those companies at a lower rate, which becomes beneficial. There's a lot of analytical studies based on the analysis of many companies, and green financing today is developing quite actively. So what are the challenges? There is no final definition. What kind of bonds or investment credits are green or which are not? We haven't developed the verification system. So how investors can trust the information that is being disclosed. There is no single format for the disclosure of information. So these are the three pillars that we focus on. There's several taxonomy centers, the American Bloomberg Center, the ICMA, the Capital Market Association in Europe. There's formats developed by China. There's a taxonomy that's been operating in Russia, and they're quite different. So we need to have some limited number of formats, such as the accounting standards. We have international standards of accounting, and more or less the market is managing with those two formats. They're dominating. So we need to do the same with the green financing taxonomy. Verification. The information that has not been verified is worth nothing. So we've decided that in Russia, the Center for Accreditation and Verification, the WebRF, will be in charge of it. they have launched this process. It's almost finalized. And I hope this year and early next year, the first verificators will be accredited and will develop the self-regulating standard for such verification. So the investors will have trustworthy information on whether what has been declared in the financial statements is true. So this is the same situation right now with the financial audits. The third pillar are the disclosure standards. In annual reports, a lot of Russian companies, with the help of the central bank, have been doing it. And now, together with the Ministry of the Economy, we've been developing a law on some soft regulation that will be followed by the requirements, legal requirements on what and how has to be disclosed. So in Russia, it will create a system that is not too much different from the EU. And green financing will have green finances will have this status based on the standard technology. So in the Moscow Exchange today, we already have a section of green bonds, and even one state company released some bonds with no time limits. So the activity is quite intensive, and surveys show that there is a demand on the part of physical persons, demand for green financing, because people are responsible. People who are part of a civil society are responsible for the tomorrow's situation. So they are ready to buy those securities, although the income may be lower. So this is like the civil stance. We need to make sure that we have like the proper green bonds. And as the central bank, we know that trust is the soul of the financial market. So we need to create mechanism to develop this trust. Without trust, the economy is very pricey and not effective. If there is the atmosphere of trust that is built on stable, sustainable institutions, I think that everything will be developing more effectively. The companies will have the resources to reduce their impact on the economy, and the citizens will have a chance to take part in the future of their country. Thank you very much for a detailed answer. So I would like to talk about digitalization now, and maybe about the collaboration of Russia and the EU, and start with the fact that today states take a lot of documents at the level of regulators concerning the digitalization of certain industries. At the same time, we see that private companies sometimes start implementing some trends or a technology that mostly have not been regulated, and they are not part of those state policy, of those regulating policies. Who in the nearest future will be the main driver of digitalization in Russia and the EU? The state or private companies? We started dealing with the digitalization of the financial sector when we had this status of the mega regulator in 2013. We created the first group together with the financial market participants dedicated to the digital process. In 2013, we adopted this strategy for the financial development, and now the digital sphere helps us become more transparent. So what is digitalization, and what's the influence it has on the financial sector? Digitalization is distant distribution channels for the financial products. We now know about marketplaces, so the pandemic makes us buy all the products online, so this trend is impossible without digitalization, and the same for the financial market. Today, the majority of services are provided distantly. I think that we'll have over 90% of digitalization in Russian economy, and as for the separate banks, this figure exceeded 95-96%. then the change in the value creation change. It's called disintermediation, when new business models just remove the unnecessary elements thanks to the digitalization, and some services that have been on the market for ages will disappear, will be replaced by new ones. So the regulator places a lot of responsibility on the planned transfer from one kind of competition to another one. So competition, digitalization changes the competitive scale. On the one hand, it helps develop gigantic ecosystems that, thanks to the market forces, to the network effect, become more powerful. On the other hand, it gives a chance to startups to propose some unique products, unique services, and conquer their market share quite quickly. That's why digitalization does change the competitive landscape. And the competition law that we have is not enough for the adequate governing. The anti-monopoly package is being drafted right now. Then digitalization gives us big data. A person is not able to cover a huge amount of data that exists on the financial market. On the contrary, a computer can do it. So as a result, we have high quality solutions, and robots replace humans. They do not replace. On the one hand, the number of people in the financial sector will reduce, and the profile of jobs will also reduce. The higher school of economics are training students, so they need to think of what kind of knowledge profile, what kind of skills a financial expert needs due to the digital processes. So the jobs that have been in demand over the last 20 years may not be so much in demand in the near future. And the last thing, digitalization helps drastically reduce the amount of account if a person wants to participate in investment activities. Because previously investment activities were accessible only to the rich. Financial consultations were quite expensive. That was the VIP market, and now the Russian financial market. So this is the European trend as well. You can have just $100 and start investing through different collective investment schemes. So the digits will reach each person. Each person will have a chance to tap the potential of the financial market and have all the services. So the market will be growing extensively, at the same time posing new risks and challenges to the regulator and the financial intermediaries. But the digital processes have expanded the services coverage as well. This is a very important trend. As for the relations with Europe, the development of the internet and digital technology makes this market extraterritorial, which increases its efficiency thanks to the global competition. Also concerning the economic sanctions that have been introduced, it's strange and stupid that Europe, the EU and G20 make a lot of efforts to globalize the market, while certain countries use this globalization as a tool to reach their own political objectives. So this impedes globalization. It makes countries become financially self-sufficient, have their own infrastructure. And any transfer of politics into the economic industry is harmful for the economy. So I agree with the Chancellor. Russia is also experiencing certain pressure from the EU. It has to have its own system of plastic cards, of financial transfer of financial messages. We know that SWIFT, under the pressure of the US, which is connected in Belgium, had to disconnect Iran from the transfer of financial messages. So what does not kill us makes us stronger. And Russia has covered a huge way to create this global infrastructure on its territory. We are self-sufficient now, and we are effective enough to stand the international competition, to provide the financial resources of different kinds. Nevertheless, the globalization trend will go on and will face a phenomenon when the providers from the EU will propose services to Russian retailers and vice versa. So we need to make regulators interact. We need to exchange information to mutually acknowledge each other's jurisdictions in terms of effective supervision. So the EU is not now considering Russian requests to acknowledge different infrastructural institutions. So we are in a dead end. So Alexander said that it's important to have a unified verification system for carbon certificates, because if the Russian carbon certificates are not acknowledged by Europe, this is actually the creation of artificial barriers for the exports of Russian products to the European market. And Russian efforts in this common deal on the absorption of carbon will not be as efficient as they could be if the verification was in place. So these political obstacles need to be removed. We live on one planet, we breathe the same air, so any attempts to create advantages for certain countries through climatic restrictions are very cynical, and they will not lead to any positive consequences. They will not lead to absorption of carbon. That's why we are ready to the fact that Russian citizens through the internet will have the financial proposals from Europe and the other way around. So it's important for us to improve protective mechanism to protect the consumers and not to make trust challenging. So you spoke about risks, and we have a question in our chat. Is digitalization promoting security of users, or may it lead to leakages of information? Any primitive system are low efficient but more resilient to crisis. So this is not a choice between good and bad. This is a choice to have low productive economy, resilient to crisis, or try to make economy more effective but have quite complicated risk management tools. So we choose the second option. The same is with cars. A very simple example. So no one will have the idea of banning cars. And we work on reducing the death rate due to accidents through making cars more secure, through training training students, through improving the road situation. So Russia is not an exception here. We need to improve our risk management toolkit and not to prevent the technology development, just increase the productivity, increase the consumer satisfaction. In terms of risk management, it's all often connected with the necessity of some regulation of those activities. And sometimes the regulation lags behind the technology that have already been implemented. Quite recently, we adopted a law on digital assets, and we'll discuss it at our roundtables today. So what is the discussion of what a digital asset is and what's going to be the attitude of the state towards it? We've been discussing it for a couple of years already because people were thinking of whether to use those assets or not, and some people have started using it. Don't you think that this kind of luxury for taking time to adopt some mechanisms is excessive? Because the technology has been developing quite rapidly, it's been implemented on the market, and the legal aspect is lagging behind. I'm not a conservative person, but we cannot call it like luxury. It's worse to launch some not verified technology that may discredit the trust. The depository law has been discussed for 10 years and the law about digital assets for 3 years. So the Russian parliament has really accelerated in considering some complicated projects. So what is a digital asset? And do we need to rush here? The whole world and Russia as well have been following the principle of technological neutrality. So the technology used to build a financial tool should not be very significant. It's important what kind of financial essence this tool has. Digital financial assets, by their essence, they just copy the securities, the bonds, the shares. They will be regulated the same way. The technology itself of the distributed registry of smart contracts, this is a revolution for the Russian legal system, because the Russian legal system is based on the principle of interaction of persons. And in the registry, there is no person, there is no responsibility. So for lawyers, it was quite a challenge. Not only in Russia, we are not really lagging behind. We are one of among the top countries to introduce those laws. And a couple of years, we had this story with the cryptocurrency, ICO, and it's been reconsidered massively. The expectations that we had about the new financial instruments turned out to be disappointing, because it turned out that over 90% of ICO in the US resulted in nothing. The money was just stolen from the investors. And if we speak about the cryptocurrency, it's not a settlement means now, it's just a more technological financial pyramid. But the market has a huge potential. We need to be, however, careful with it. Security is the most thing that supports the trust on the financial market. We are not left aside. We're not thinking of when some kind of law will be introduced. We've created some regulatory organism that helps a startup enter it, and they can show us how it works. Then we test their business model, their technology, together with the Bank of Russia. And the representatives from the state participate in this activity. After that, we decide which kind of regulation will be applied. We rejected several startups that proposed to create cryptocurrencies. We supported other startups that were based on some oil products. And so the absence of law is not preventing this process. And now that we have this law already adopted, a couple of startups have already launched their activities. So all the businessmen that are ready to use new technology, we invite them to join our initiative. So we are ready to work with you. But the same as in medicine, it's more risky to issue some non-tested, like medical drug, than to have some delays in its testing, because the trust on the financial market cannot be regained. Speaking about your initiative that is called like a sandpit, after our discussion, we'll have like a workshop. And if someone is interested in this central bank initiative, you may ask question further on. So the last question is about more traditional institutions, about banks. What is the future of banks? Will traditional physical offices of banks disappear, or they will transform and be both in an offline and online formats. So the phrase "in the nearest future" needs to be discussed. Bill Gates said once that people do need banks, people need financial services. Now this phrase is interpreted differently. People do not need financial services. People acquire them because they need some kind of other services. So you don't need a mortgage, you need an apartment. That's why you have this mortgage, because you need an apartment. I believe that commodization of the banking business has already started. We've created marketplaces trading financial products, and banks, when analyzing credit risks, moved from manual labor to the whole credit fabrics. So the banking business is becoming more and more boring, and probably in the future it will disappear amid the diversity of financial intermediaries. But it's not a quick process. In Russia, we have several generations that have different patterns, behavioral patterns. Baby boomers are quite conservative, and they have more savings due to their age, but they have more requirement. They will need banking services. So for the nearest 10 years, I would not say that the question about classical banks disappear. It's not a question right now. Of course, they will be somehow pushed by the digital banks. So the role of ecosystems is very important. How this business model will kill the classical model. So to sum up, I would like to ask some questions about the relations between Russia and EU in the spheres that they are presenting. So what region or country do you see as your partner? There are some big countries in the EU with a bigger part of GDP that are leaders. Does that mean that with the other countries, we are not like building such close relations? So if we speak about big countries, will the ratio of countries with whom we communicate more, will it change? Are there any trends in this partnership relations? I don't see the EU as a union of independent countries. It's more or less an organized system. And even if with certain countries we have good relations, good partnership, but the level of centralization is quite high, and the decision is about relations is also taken centralized. As for the questions of climatic regulations, the solutions in the EU are centralized. So it's not much depends on specific countries, but if we speak about them, we need to have discussions with countries that are consuming Russian products more, that are consuming Russian energy resources, raw materials. First of all, Germany, that will be have defining approach in the EU policy.
Александр Викторович, Сергей Анатольевич, спасибо большое за ваше участие сегодня.
Thank you very much for your participation in our panel discussion and your opinions.
Мы вышли в прямой эфир, и он останется на нашем YouTube-канале.
We were broadcasting live on our YouTube channel, so it will be recorded, and our listeners will be able to listen to it. So thank you very much to Mr. Karen had to leave us due to his tight schedule, but he apologized. So thank you very much, and we hope that this discussion will not be unnoticed, that it will generate some ideas and that our experts may have some new ideas. So thank you very much. We hope that Russia and EU cooperation will transform further on. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Спасибо большое.
Хорошего вам дня.